I'm delighted to see so many of you have remained with us for the final panel. And without further ado, I would like to hand things over to my friend and colleague, Professor Aaron Panofsky of the UCLA Department of Public Policy and the Institute for Society and Genetics, who will be moderating our panel, which is devoted to the translation of research on hate into practical and meaningful outcomes. And so, Aaron, that's okay. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Wait, and I need my paper. That's Great, well, thank you so much. So I'd like to just briefly introduce my three panelists. First, we have Deslin Chapman on the to my right, the Deputy Director of Content and Curriculum for the organization called Learning for Justice. In the middle, we have Anne Gilliand, who's a professor of information studies here at UCLA. And then to my right directly, we have Joumana Silyan-Saba, right? Yes. The Director of Civic Participation and Human Rights in the LA City Department of Human Rights and Equity. And so, as David said, that we're trying to talk about how to think about the relationship between research on hate and interventions to reduce or ameliorate hate. And so I guess what I would like to do is to sort of have each panelist kind of introduce themselves through my sort of introductory question to them. So I'm going to start with Joumana. And what I wanted to say is that I understand that Los Angeles stands out from other major cities for the way it takes hate seriously as a structural problem and not just sort of like an enhancement to certain criminal acts, for example. So can you talk a little bit about the city's approach and describe some of its efforts and your involvement in them?
Sure. Thank you so much, Aaron. If I may first start by thanking the ISH team, David, Maya, Amelia, I hope I didn't leave anybody out, and all the presenters, because let me just say, it's just refreshing. There's a lot of information, and I very much appreciate that, but I just want to say it's refreshing that there is this space where we're actually very intently wanting to better understand so that we could have better solutions in a positive way forward. And I just want to really appreciate that. From somebody who's been doing this work for quite a long time, I heavily rely on the research, on the data, because we could sit in City Hall or our government cocoons thinking that we're doing the right thing when in reality we're missing a whole lot of information. So very much appreciate your work and the research and all the students who were also acknowledged earlier, because everything you do does help inform not only what we do in terms of policy, but also how we think of initiatives and where we can better implement initiatives. And so about the point about data, and then I do want to talk a little bit more about what the City of LA is doing. When we look at hate trends and when we look at data, we know, first of all, we're not really looking at current data. And we also know that we're looking at missing pieces and parts of the data. So anecdotally, we know that there's just a lot more going on than what we're actually seeing in numbers. And even though when we look at numbers, let's just say we more so broadly look at it in terms of what does that tell us in terms of trends. Specifically on hate and hate reporting, the more we started to look at these issues and understanding that the trends are on the rise, we're hearing it more anecdotally, but we're not really seeing it in numbers. We started to really think about the why. Why is this happening? And the more we looked at the why, we understood and realized that there were all sorts of barriers that we were just not thinking about. Because on the government side, and I shouldn't really say side, but in the government structures, hate reporting goes to law enforcement. That's just broadly, generally speaking. In LA in particular, hate crimes reporting goes to LAPD, but LAPD, unlike some other law enforcement agencies, they also take hate incidents reporting. While they do take hate incidents reporting and they do look at it more so from a data collection, we're still not seeing the numbers. So as we sort of peeled the various layers, we understood that, one, we're really not creating the avenues in the space because, there's this trust issue. Not only, just in general, there's trust issues in reporting to government, but reporting to law enforcement in particular. And the more we looked at the communities who are impacted, for example, immigrant populations, LGBTQ communities, Black communities, the more we started to look at who is impacted, the more we realized it's not going to be that simple for them to report, because the trust issue that I talked about, trust barriers, there's also language barriers. And especially as we look at immigrant populations, language barriers, fear of government. But the other thing is how we talk about hate was another barrier. Because even the word hate isn't necessarily translated into other languages. And so they may not even recognize that they've been subjected to it or they've been a victim of hate. And so kind of, and there are several other barriers, I'm not going to go into all of it. So thinking about this structurally, we wanted to make sure that we're removing these barriers and creating avenues for reporting outside of law enforcement only. So the first thing we did is we looked at what exists within the city structures that we could utilize. And I have to really give credit to members of city council as well that worked with us on this. And, in government, there is a thing called the political will. And I'm just, it helps to have that political will from elected leaders. And so we looked at our existing structure, and then we realized that we do have other means of reporting. And this is when we activated 311. 311 is a number that everyone in the city knows to call, and that's to pick up bulky items, but you could ask for anything you need in terms of city services. Why not activate that to also report hate crimes and hate incidents? And it just gave an opportunity for an alternative to calling 911 or law enforcement. And so what we did is we worked to match our data sets, fields I should say, but we also looked at our colleagues at the county level as well. And when we think of data, we often think of, okay, how are we going to collect the data and what do these fields look like? And so we wanted to match these fields. So as we pulled the data, we were comparing sort of similar sets of data. At our county level, we have our 211. Our 211, they're not part of the county government. They're actually a nonprofit organization. But the beauty about 211 is that they also have social wraparound services. So at the city level, we wanted to not only expand our own structures, but we wanted to connect to other existing reporting mechanisms and structures. And certainly looking at, and I know we've had some representation in the room from our partners and colleagues in the nonprofit space, and often they're the ones who will get the first reports, right? And, we have representatives from Stop AAPI Hate in the room, and we had somebody from ADL. So that's sort of like our third bucket of data that we actually look at. Even though they do not report directly through our pipelines, we do take that data into consideration. So in kind of structurally expanding that, we wanted to create better access, but for our own internal understanding of better data, better numbers, right? So that's the structural. The other piece, and I heard it sort of in the room earlier, and I think there was a conversation about not only misinformation, but also messaging. As we started to put out the messaging, we struggled with putting the word hate in our message. We almost very intentionally did not want the word hate in our campaign. And so the LA City campaign is LA for all. We all belong, right? That's a message that people will feel more connected with, right? And we do not have the sort of research and understanding, and government I think is the worst in terms of messaging, but we understood that if we were going to be effective in this, we needed a unifying message. So that is available in 21 languages because we also understood that there was barriers when it comes to language. And it's funny because, as we were looking at translations, we didn't want to just have a translation services. We actually went to people in the community and said, does this resonate, right? Because I can translate the word hate into whatever language, but does it resonate? And so there's also that aspect of it. So structure, messaging, and the last thing, and we'll talk more because I want to give an opportunity to my fellow panelists as well. The last thing I'll say is, structure, messaging, policy, and initiatives is the third thing that I wanted to mention. One of the things that we have, and I know we have one of our commissioners in the room, Commissioner Morgan Green with the Human Relations Commission, which is a commission that was established shortly after the Watts civil unrest in 1968, specifically looking at race relations in the city of LA. So the kinds of initiatives that we create through this work in terms of intergroup relations, in terms of creating spaces for dialogue, it's being in those spaces, it gives us an opportunity to informally create neutral spaces for dialogue, where we have the ability to bring people from different groups and different perspectives so that we can begin to have a better conversation and more understanding that helps us then to do things in a different way as a city. So I'm going to stop here and I'll talk a little bit more about the discrimination enforcement and the LA civil rights, but I just wanted to start with that sort of as a framing.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect, that's wonderful. Maybe you can pass the mic to Deslin. I'd like to ask her. So often we think about confronting hate after the fact, after there's been an event, a violent act, something like this, the reporting that Joumana was talking about. But I think Learning for Justice really aims to prevent hateful acts before they occur. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that strategy, what you do, and how
Thank
it
you
works.
very much, first of all. And I was very happy to listen to all of the research because as I was listening to them, there was so much in that correlates to our work and to how we work. In terms of preventative, we look at it in a systems approach for prevention, intervention, and response. So it's sort of looking at how we can do this holistically. And Learning for Justice is a program of the Southern Poverty Law Center. We have another program, the Intelligence Project. And they do a lot of the reports, the Hate Watch, and the sort of programs on responses. And we use a lot of that in terms of our education projects. So for education, we look a lot at narrative and also resources. So, the conversation that you had about narrative, I think in Bosnia and Ireland reminded me of the conversations we have on honest history when we're talking about the South, and when we're talking about the Civil War and how that's framed, particularly in the South. And so we're looking at it from those perspectives as well. So we have, we do resources, and all of our materials are available for free in terms of addressing the issues of speaking up at school when there's issues of hate and bias, but also preparing administrators for how do you respond, having a plan in place before there's a crisis moment, before you have to respond to something happening. And with those resources, we provide training, we provide workshops on those topics. In terms of the narrative focus, with our magazine, we try to touch on a lot of the issues. How do we dialogue across differences? How do we address the issues of LGBTQ hate? How do we look at it upstream far enough in terms of with young people? And then also with the response model, looking at it not so much from a punitive perspective, but how do restorative practices play into this? Not just the restorative justice when we get to, okay, something has happened and we need to have that healing, but restorative practice all the way through, where we're building relationships, We're having educators and community members and families come together, looking at creating that type of inclusive environment, first of all. And then when we get to the point where, you know, these issues and these things will happen, looking at, we talked a lot today, I think, about the definition of hate. How do we move, and how does it move from prejudice and bias to hate? And how do we intervene in that space? Because a lot of the things we see at school are not necessarily hate. They're bias, there's prejudice, there's that curiosity, I think someone mentioned, that comes out in the wrong way. There is lack of understanding. And when we separate that out in terms of the intentionality of hate and then the response to it to those communities that are harmed, a lot of our resources focus on supporting those who are harmed by hate. And that's the type of focus that we're looking at and developing right now. We've got some resources, and I'm looking forward to considering how the research that we looked at today can play into a lot of that.
Great, that's extremely interesting, and I'm actually thrilled at the overlap between so many of the themes that keep coming up, so I look forward to talking more about that. And so I want to turn now to Anne and say, and ask you to tell us a little bit about like the long career of research that you have engaged in that sort of looks at the intersection between collective memory, technology, hate, and in different national contexts. And you were just telling me about how, you know, you had your youth in Northern Ireland and also some experience in some of the other contexts that we talked about. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of that research and some of your findings.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you also to the ISH organizers. This has been an amazing afternoon listening to everybody. And I will say I'm also one of the PIs on the SMASH project, so I think we're well represented today. So with all due respect to Kevin, I actually am a Derry girl. So I grew up in Northern Ireland through the decades of the Troubles, and my area is archival studies, but I'm a kind of unusual archival person. Because I'm really interested in the future, but I'm also very interested in the long tail of memory. So I have worked for about 20 years in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Croatia. I was working in Nagorno-Karabakh and in Armenia, and I work in Northern Ireland as well. So yes, so one of the things that people say about Northern Ireland, they say the same thing also about Bosnia as well, is that you got a peace accord, and it stopped the violence, but it moved to a different form of warfare. It was warfare through memory. So I'm really interested in memory as something that is very, very easily activated into hate. And one of the things from the research that I've done that shows is there's a really long tail on memory. So atrocities, traumas, fears, they don't just live for years. They don't live for generations, they live for centuries. You talk to Bosnian Serbs, they'll tell you 1,000 years, right? In Northern Ireland, they'll tell you, Protestants will tell you 400 years, right? So, and they're so easy to reactivate again. So I'm very interested in this phenomenon of memory. I have another research project that is actually a diaspora project that's funded by the European Union, and we've been looking at diaspora communities from Hungary, from the Netherlands, from Spain, from Franco Spain, and also from Croatia. And those kinds of memory politics, they move out into diasporas as well. So we're looking at how they move out and what effect they have on the home country, but they also come into Los Angeles, right? So I'm really interested in the sort of systemic nature of hate and how it moves, and how do we've talked before too about how you can maybe interrupt this. So one of the concepts I'm interested in is the sort of stuckness that comes with memory. And I'm a memory professional, so I should be celebrating memory, but a lot of what I deal with are the problems of memory over time. So the other part of me is a systems person. So I'm interested in the design of systems, information systems, record-keeping systems, and ways that we can move people beyond that stuckness in various ways. So I would say, and I think it echoes a lot of what we heard already today, for me, the three big interventions that come out of this work, first of all, education. Education because and I'm going to nod to my historian colleagues in the room here because I'm not a historian, but education teaches context. It teaches historical context. We're missing so much historical context around a lot of politics of memory and memorialization as well, but also education in the form of information and media literacy. We have to intervene with children at the youngest age. We have to continue to intervene all the way through formal education. We have to intervene with parents. We have to intervene with communities. We have to intervene with politicians. And education is just so incredibly important. So that would be one. A second is trust. Trust is breaking down all over the place, and many of the people who are very easily triggered into hate have tremendous distrust of all, not just of other kinds of people, but of authorities as well. So solutions are not necessarily sending in the authorities or sending in the police or sending in the soldiers or whatever it is. And people come into this context from other parts of the world where they have not trusted authorities, and they bring that with them as well. I think it's not terribly well recognized. And I think the third thing is affect. That we do not approach, certainly a lot of our research, through the lens of emotion. There's a huge amount of emotion there, and if we don't see that, and if we don't accept it, and if we don't respect people and their emotions, it's very hard to get beyond that.
Extremely helpful, thank you. So maybe I'll just pose a question to the panel, and whoever sort of feels inspired can pick it up. I'm very struck by the relationship between hate as an episode or an event or a particular happening, relationship between two people or a little group, and then hate as a kind of system, as a culture, as a pervasive mood or tone within a neighborhood or a society even. What do you think about the relationship between those two? Like how can we, how do interventions interrupt on either side of the equation there? Should we always be targeting the sort of local and individual, or are there ways to address kind of more systemically what's going on? I don't know. This is a hard question, but I'm wondering if anyone would like to
take a crack at it, but I'd love to hear from the fellow panelists as well. I think both and all and everything. I think we have to really view this sort of on a continuum, if you will, right? Because if we think of hate and we think of the seeds of hate that often lead to some of, genocide and atrocities, these are not just things that happen in the past. These are things that have remnants, and they stay with people, and they stay in the psyche of people. I have Armenian background. I know from those conversations, and even though I don't speak Armenian, my great grandfather was killed. My grandfather escaped into Aleppo, Syria, where he was born, grew up, didn't even speak Armenian. But there is an aspect in the psyche of that trauma that just stays with the generation after generation, right? But I do want to separate the trauma in the emotional nature, and I do want to separate that from hate, right? Because you can still experience trauma and it stays in the psyche. That doesn't mean that you're also going to perpetuate that cycle of hate, right? And especially where, and I'll speak for my own personal experiences, because sometimes those personal stories are the best way to relate, right? My neighbor down the street is Turkish. One of the best neighbors ever, right? And so could I even frame that in the context of does that mean that I don't have that awareness? The trauma of a genocide? No, it stays with me. That doesn't mean I'm going to look at every person from that prism. And I think if we can get to the point, and we talked a lot about it in the morning, how do we humanize each other, and how do we see each other as a human being with our own sets of narratives and stories and histories that are all valid. I can't say one is more valid than the other, or one is less than the other. And so I think that's important. Staying with this thought of a continuum, we talked a little bit about, I think you brought up interventions and some of the work on prevention. That is a continuum. I think if we're looking for social change, meaningful social change, we need to really view this work as constant and ongoing, right? We need to have the brave conversations. I think Aziza talked about that earlier this morning. And we can't stop there, right? We have to look at prevention, intervention, and enforcement. I wouldn't, again, that's a continuum, right? We need to have all of that.
I would say to that, and what you said about education allows for that system in a lot of ways, because you can start at that early age, and not just with sort of the diversity education of knowing that there's so many differences and that acceptance that we can build in young children, but also those brave conversations. How do we train educators to facilitate and to engage young people to have those types of conversations early, where we're looking at diversity, we're learning about one another, but we're also not afraid to talk about those things that are difficult, and where we're not so quick to judge when someone asks those questions. Because, when you're doing it with children in a lot of ways, we have more of that space of saying we're going to open it up and make space and use dialogue in training that. Now, if we can teach those skills and start teaching them at the earliest stages, it will move that continuum in a lot of ways, because you can have that dialogue continue. We also look at ways in communities to address this. There is a new program that we are going to collaborate with, that the SPLC, the Intelligence Project, is collaborating with Peril on, and it's called Care Centers in the Communities. And it's looking at hate and extremism from sort of a health perspective and a community perspective, and bringing on board a lot of community facilitators and factors into that. But it's going to be specific to the community that that particular center is in. And this is a project being piloted right now. But in terms of what you said, not the episodes of hate, but the environment and the community level in addressing that, also comes back to the question of authority and those communities that have that fear of authority. So having it from a community's perspective can help to address that. But I would also say, while we are recognizing that authority figures, whether it's law enforcement, there's that negative experience, I think in terms of bridge building, we have to build those bridges as well. We have to work in some ways to make sure that as we're building this in a community, we're not leaving that aspect out, because reality says at some point there's going to be that interaction. So that bridge building part of it is also going to be necessary.
One of the things that I really worry about, even after lots of education, is how quickly a situation can change. It changed when I was a child in Northern Ireland, and it was just like overnight. It changed in Croatia, similarly like that. And in many ways, it's changed even here inside the university. in a really, really quick amount of time. And we've done so much work to try to preempt that from happening, and yet it happens. And so, you know, I think a lot about, when we think about, I mentioned before, sort of memory as something that's very easily triggered. It's people deliberately trigger those memories, right? They trigger them through the media, they trigger them inside families, they trigger them politically. Now they trigger also through technology and through social media. And I think we have to think about how we can defuse those triggers, because they do. There is absolutely no doubt that these pasts sit inside families and they sit inside communities, and they're latent. They mourn them without always even realizing that that's what they do, and it's so easy to activate those. And I think the thinking about, as somebody who comes from Northern Ireland, and that one of the things that there is so important, and it's the same in parts of the Balkans as well, the education systems have to be integrated. They're segregated, and as long as people do not know each other, they will never get to trust each other. That has to be addressed. We have to teach multiple histories simultaneously. We can't just teach our own histories, but we must respect our own histories, I think, at the same time. And I think the other thing, and again, thinking particularly about Bosnia and Northern Ireland, is that we have to have, and I think probably also now the Middle East, we have to have our eyes on something better that's in the future. If we have nothing to work to, we've no reason to move away from this kind of inter-community hate that's so easily triggered. So.
Right. So I want to pick up on some themes that you all have already mentioned and connect it back to, you know, my own thinking as I'm a professor in the Department of Public Policy. I have all these colleagues that are applied economists, political scientists, and others. And often we think of the sort of policy interventions as, okay, what laws can we change? What incentives can we establish? You know, kind of these sort of very nuts and bolts things. But so much of what we've been discussing here and throughout the whole afternoon are things like narrative. How do we change narratives? How do we do work that targets affect, right? That targets emotions, not just interests, or not just fear of consequences, things like that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What does it mean to do, you know, interventions or public policy, broadly speaking, on emotions, on narratives? How do you think about that?
To acknowledge that they're important first.
Yes.
I think that, I mean, I don't think, certainly in my own field, they have not been part of the conversation until recently, and now they are. And it's a seismic change inside the field, and I think that's probably true in a lot of the humanities and social sciences now.
And to build on that thought, and I think also something that Deslin talked about, and that's this understanding this from a public health model, right? And so 4 years ago, we would never have thought about this work around how do we do this work on hate prevention, extremism, and polarization. We consistently sort of hit our head against the wall, like, okay, policy, what policy do we need? We just needed a fresh framework and a fresh set of eyes. And we actually worked with UCLA in the research that was done by Dr. Eisenman. And how do we better understand this in terms of resilience? And how do we understand this from a public policy perspective? So, yes, I mean, when you talk about policy, it can just be sort of, you know, pretty dry. But it is very much informed by the stories. It is very much informed by the emotional aspects we've talked about. It's informed by the work that you're all doing in this room in terms of research. So I just, you know, these are things that, when it comes to how we think of policy, these are all things that we take into consideration. I do want to talk about advocacy for a moment. Because, again, the Civil Human Rights and Equity Department did not exist prior to 2020. That was the work of advocacy. It was advocacy groups who went to the city, who advocated for new policy. Out of that, the Civil Human Rights Law was born. Prior to 2019, the city did not have the Civil and Human Rights Law. And when we talk about enforcement, when it comes to policy, not only did the city create the Civil Human Rights Law, there was a subsequent department whose part of the job of the department is to enforce the Civil Human Rights Law, which prohibits discrimination in the private sector. That's education, employment, housing, and commerce, right? You know, we have other parameters, but we also work with our colleagues at the state level, and I know we have some of our colleagues, I see you, Alec, in the back, with our state level, which we, again, when we think of policy, we can't just think of policy at the local level. It's how that policy transcends the state to the global, and then finally the federal. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't leave that piece out in terms of advocacy. One thing I'll add, and I'd love to kind of hear more from my fellow panelists on this notion of intervention, because one of the things that we don't see much of is the work of intervention. How do you intervene with individuals who are on a path towards violence, right? Right now, we just have the criminal justice system. We talk about prevention in the upstream in terms of education, and that's all things we need. But I'd love to see more understanding on how to intervene. One of the organizations I'm familiar with is Life After Hate. Life After Hate is an organization that specifically works with formers, and these are neo-Nazi, white supremacy formers who are looking to exit the movement. And then we forget that there's a whole other layer of the family, the friends, the neighbors, and the community. And when we think of those challenges, and when we think of the intervention, and just broadly speaking, crime in general is emotional in nature, but hate crimes in particular not only impact the victim, but they impact the family, and they impact the entire community, quite frankly, the entire city. So we have to put it into perspective.
I would say in terms of the interventions that you mentioned, looking at, particularly with young people, looking at how restorative practices and restorative justice can step into that space before we're moving towards the carceral system with those interventions, and what those practices might look like depending on the type of crime, the type of hate that we're looking at as well. Interventions too, we look at how do we mitigate some of the things that are happening in media? How do we mitigate with young people in particular, not just educators, but including all of the adults in that ecosystem? And there are certain programs that are being done through Peril as well, which is through the American University, that is addressing that. How do we train counselors? How do we train community members? How do we train all of the adults in that ecosystem to recognize what is happening with a young person at that point? To bring this back to the topic as well of narrative, and we look at this a lot in the South as being part of the Southern Poverty Law Center, is the narrative there, the lost cause narrative, the narratives that fuel some of that underlying emotion and hate in that region. And how do you start to dismantle some of that narrative as well? Not just counter it with the honest history and the other narratives that have been silenced for a while, but starting to dismantle some of that narrative that has gone on. And we look at projects like Whose Heritage is another project that we work with, which is the renaming of schools. We have schools that Black children are going to that are named after Civil War Confederate generals. And so there's the movement, and a lot of that are student movements as well. Young people are involved in that, in wanting to make those changes. So how do we support those youth activism? We also look at the models of civil engagement and civil rights. How do we not just teach the history of, Rosa Parks was tired and sat down, but how do we teach what that organizing philosophy was? To teach that history as a history of movement building and a history of organizing, not just the events that happened. And that's starting to be something, the shift in narrative that we're looking for there. And of course, as you know, that is what's being pushed out of the classrooms right now in some of those states.
This is great. I have a long list of great questions, but I think we only have a couple more minutes left. I want to ask just one as sort of to bring us back to a dialogue between the researchers and the people who are trying to apply things. Are there any burning sort of questions or unknowns affecting your work or the kind of interventions or the kind of policies you're seeking to build? Are there unknowns that you wish we researchers would start to tackle?
Where do I start?
Yeah.
I know we have a 1 minute, so I'm just going to leave it at intervention. I'd love to see more research around intervention, what would healthy intervention looks like. We've had some form of webinars and trainings on bystander, what happens, but how do we act with them? We talked about breaking the cycle today, right? And we talked about breaking the cycle from sort of the historical narrative, from the storytelling, bridge building, all of those things that we need. But how do we break a cycle of an individual who might be on a path, right? And so I'd love to learn more about that. And then politicization of hate. I'd love to learn more. Like if there's research on that, I'd love to learn more on that.
I would say the wonderful research on the fact that policy in the media is extremely valuable, because we were thinking of, we do a lot of these education resources and they talk to educators, and we've been constantly told you need to start having those conversations with parents, and we are. But we're told, you need to change that, and how do you message that? And to know that people are responding to policies means that we can present that information and just gear it towards that audience. We don't have to negate the policy parts of that and the informational parts of that. So that was very helpful. The other type of research I think that I would particularly be interested in is, what are some of those vulnerabilities to extremism? Where are they recruiting young people from? What are the spheres? What are the things that make certain young people more vulnerable to this type of recruitment? Because if we're going to do those interventions, we need to understand clearly where and when and how this is happening so that we can develop those strategies for intervention.
Well, when you were talking about Southern narratives, actually it also reminded me a lot of Northern Ireland and Bosnia, and there are populations there that need to have their narratives diffused, right? But their identities are completely tied in with those narratives, and they tend at the moment to be some of the most disenfranchised working class individuals. I think we see this in the United States too. And the question is, what can be done to intervene there? Because I think those are populations that turn to radicalism really easily.
Bosnia was my dream.
Well, with that, I'd just like to ask everyone to thank the panelists for and so now I'll pass it over to Maya.
Thank you. You can stay here if you want, stay put if you'd like. Thank you all. Can we get another round of applause for Aaron and Joumana and Deslin and really everybody who presented and spoken today. I think it has been a really phenomenal and I would venture to say rare conversation, rare in a few ways. One, because we have something like 20 disciplines in the room, academic disciplines in the room. And 2, because we have government, nonprofit, academia, and more in the room. And I think that that is the vision that we had for the Initiative to Study Hate at the very beginning. And we're thrilled to have you all as our partners in really fighting hate. I think that is and understanding it in order to mitigate, combat it, and ultimately end it. Because we are ambitious like that at UCLA. I think that it is an immensely difficult task, and yet what are we doing if not this at UCLA, at a big research institution like this one? I want to say a few things before we break for our beautiful reception outside and you have a chance to talk to one another. First, I want to thank all of our Initiative to Study Hate researchers, postdocs, faculty. Can I just ask all of you to stand so that we see just what this community looks like and how many of you are involved? Beautiful. Thank you. You make this work what it is, so thank you all. Second, I want to actually invite Dr. Naomi Taub to share a word about our upcoming blog that we will be publishing if you want to keep up with our work. Oh, thanks, Aaron.
Hi. I won't talk for too long because I know everyone's excited for wine. Just to say that to pick up on some of the really beautiful themes that we've been talking about all day, one of the great things we do here is produce information. Information is an incredibly valuable resource, but it really becomes valuable when it's shared, not just in rooms like this, although rooms like this are very important, but even just on this campus alone, there are people who are looking for this information, who also just want to know that people are thinking about this and trying to work towards a better future. And my background being in public humanities, I want to find a few ways to do this. And the first way that we're implementing is a blog called Notes on the Study of Hate. You can find it on the ISH website. At the top, there's a banner, and now there's a blog button on that banner, and if you click on it, you'll see a welcome post as well as our first entry from Howard Padwa's team. And our researchers are going to be continually offering posts that translate their own work into accessible terms and that hopefully can make this more shareable, more accessible, and then over time integrate more complex content and make this something that is accessible not just in the government, not just in NGOs, but like literally on our campus to people who need it. So thank you very much. Notes on the Study of Hate.
Thank you, Naomi. Naomi is one of our awesome postdoctoral scholars at the initiative and on the in-house research team that we have. So the last announcement that I'll make is that we have a new call for proposals that has just launched, offering new research grants between $5,000 and $25,000 for the next and final year of the pilot of the Initiative to Study Hate. This round of proposals is really focused on intervention, prevention, mitigation, some of the things we've been talking about in this last panel in particular. And we highly encourage researchers from UCLA to apply, especially those of you who have partnerships with outside organizations, outside actors fighting hate in the world, many of whom are here today. And so this is my really smooth transition into saying some of my favorite parts of any event are the networking parts at the end, after the programming has ended. There are some really fantastic, learners, fighters, activists, leaders in the hate space. I know, for instance, our friends at the California Civil Rights Department are in that back row over there. We have a wonderful research partnership with them. We have people from the city, people from nonprofit, and people from across campus. So please do introduce yourselves to one another, enjoy our wonderful spread outside for the next hour or so, and look out for more updates from us. You'll see emails from me or Amalia, who's back there. Let's just give one more round of applause to Amalia, who has been really the mastermind behind this whole program. And that's it. I'm not going to stand between you and snacks any longer. Have a wonderful rest of your Monday. Thank you all.